May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. I'm preaching on that. There are so many, this is one of those passages. On one hand, it's obvious, and it undoubtedly is taught to every Christian child throughout the church, and they kind of get it, right? I mean, on one level, it's completely obvious. And on another level, I mean, we're spending the rest of our lives trying to unpack what this means. And there's some special things that are happening in John, right? The first thing that we have to unpack is the fact that he's describing this as a new commandment. Jesus is. He's not saying, these aren't, as my church history professor said, helpful hints for happy living. This is a commandment. It is a law. It is the way that the world is governed and ordered. And he's saying, I'm giving you a new law which supersedes all others. This is a very big deal. What this means is it doesn't matter what the circumstance is. This law trumps that one. That's a very big deal. And we could start to unpack this, if we were all political thinkers, what the politics of this means, because the meaning of that is profound. The next thing that is huge about this is that Jesus in John, the command, says something slightly different. In all the other Gospels, Jesus says, you should love one another as you love yourself. And in John, perhaps the last Gospel written, Jesus says, you should love one another as I loved you. And this is powerful, right? Because another preacher that I heard once, he said, we're often taught in seminary to preach to a self-absorbed group of people thinking about themselves, when in reality, most of us come to church exhausted, not really feeling very good about ourselves. A lot of our tanks are empty. Our confidence can sometimes be shaken. We need to be encouraged that we can make a difference, that we can change, that we can be better and do better, which is to say we're not particularly good at loving ourselves. It does not come easy to us. Despite what the rhetoric might be that people are terrible people, well, we're often the first to judge ourselves. You know, there's exceptional people out there, but I'm not one of them. And so perhaps what the early church found was when we told people to love one another as we love ourselves, that wasn't a lot of love sometimes. Whereas Jesus not only seemed to love us, but inexplicably liked us. Jesus didn't just want to relate to us as brothers and sisters, but as friends. Jesus liked hanging out with us and thought probably that we were funny and liked our company. There's a beautiful book that I once read, The Joy of Being Liked by God, and the power of that. So we're called to love one another as God loved us, which is to say we're called to even like people, whatever that means. So there's some very, very powerful things in this. A new world order, a law that we should take very seriously as Christians, and a call to love people as God loved us. And this is given in a world that, again, people on Sunday are coming from a world that is changing hugely. It's so much And the church, the role of the church is changing. There was just a conference. I was at a conference earlier this week with all of the clergy, and you always get these comments, but for hundreds of years we lived in a society where the church ran all the schools, ran the orphanages, ran the hospitals. We cared for people with not just physical illness but mental illness, and this was at a time when people avoided children and the physically and mentally ill like they were a disease. It's difficult for us to imagine that, but I mean, there's a reason why. And you have all these little children chimney sweeps. People weren't going around the streets of London on their knees weeping and lamenting that their children were doing physical labor. It was just simply how the world worked. And we gladly as a church stepped into that and convinced society that educating children was a good thing and that it's okay to be around the sick and the suffering as long as we can find a way to care for them. And we've kind of won that. And we're sort of victims of our own success, because now often churches are like, well, now what do we do? which is a wonderful, problem. This is a restless time. We were also great teachers. We founded great schools. And we're in crisis because we're learning differently. This is a gigantic thing. This is something else one could talk about. One could write entire doctoral theses on the fact that the last time we changed the way we learn was when we invented the printing press. Right? This is a huge thing that we're struggling with as a church. It used to be for hundreds of years. Before that, before the printing press, if you wanted to know something, you go to a scholar, you go to a priest. There was the person on the hill, right? And you'd have a question, and you'd go and you'd walk 30 miles, and you'd go to the top of this hill, and you'd ask this wise person, and they would have an answer. And then you'd walk 30 miles back home, and you'd say, well, here's the answer. And maybe it may have not been right, but that's how it worked, right? And then we invented the printing press, and no longer were books handwritten out by monks hidden away in a monastery, but they were simply just printed en masse. And so we just had to go to a librarian. And the librarian said, well, here's the book you're looking for. And then we'd go home and we'd read it by ourselves. We did it with the Bible. It freaked the church out that everybody was reading the Bible on their own. They had their own Bibles. They didn't need their priests anymore because they could just read it. And freaked us out. We didn't know how to preach on that. I mean, we did not do Bible studies right away. The Bible study was a response to people reading the Bible and saying, this book is crazy. We used to avoid books. We'd say, we'd never preach on Joshua because Joshua is crazy. There's a lot of violence in Joshua. There's genocide in Joshua. It's really some really horrific stuff. So we just wouldn't preach on it because for priests, they say, well, I'm going to try to get everybody to love each other. Joshua's not going to help that much. But then people will go home and read Joshua, and now what do you do, right? So, a lot of challenges, a lot of problems. And for hundreds of years, we wrestled with this, and kind of around, the mid-20th century, kind of had certain things figured out. We had all kinds of ways of preaching. We have our prayer books, which were invented after 100 years of the printing press, so we could pray together with books, right? We didn't memorize it anymore. Okay? And then this internet was invented, and now nobody goes to libraries and looks up things on card catalogs. They just Google it, right? And so the church is struggling along with every other profession. I actually have two of my childhood friends. One of them's a doctor and one of them's a lawyer. We're a walking cliche when we get together and walk into a pub, the doctor, the priest, and the lawyer. But they were, all three of them, and this amazed me, said, it's so frustrating because my patients will show up and they've already Googled their cure. And they printed it. And they have the medication that they're supposed to take. And they have their diagnosis. And they hand it to me. I say, this is what I have. And he says, and often they're wrong, And the lawyer says the same thing. It drives me crazy, he said. My clients will, I'll give them some law. They'll go home, they'll Google it. They'll read it and say, you're dead wrong. I have this right and this right. I have to do this and this and this. And I'll say, no, the reason why you can't do that is because of this code and that code and blah, blah, blah. Because, of course, the law is very complicated. And I was fascinated by that because, of course, we have the same challenge as a church, right? We have people Googling things. Some crazy priests have their sermons and podcasts on the internet where anyone can listen to them. So we're in an age where the world is changing. Everything's different. I mean, the amount of different things. I mean, I could go on for. I won't. I could go on for hours, and I'll give you one more interesting way the world is changing, and that's the idea of our neighbor. Love our neighbor as ourselves. Well, the term immigrant is almost becoming passé. Because people don't immigrate. It used to be you grow up somewhere and you make some grand, great decision to move. And then you move, and then you make a new home and you start again. Well, now what's happening is someone grows up in China, they move to Hong Kong, they learn English, they move to Vancouver. They get a job with the federal government, they move to Ottawa, and then they move to Amsterdam. And then maybe they move back to China as an attaché for the Amsterdam government, right? They're not immigrating to Canada per se. They've just moved a bunch. And that's happening a lot. I'm a product of that. I moved from London, Ontario to Tennessee to Connecticut to Montreal to here. It's stressful. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of problems that we have to work out as a society. I couldn't simply... this is not on my manuscript because I can't think of the word. It's very difficult to assimilate into a culture for 3 years, knowing that you're going to move on, right? You can't act and think like a local after 3 years, especially when you know when you're going to leave. You're going to be a weird, different person with different ideas. You're going to be a very strange neighbor. I was a very strange neighbor. I basically turned into an American while I was in the States, and I grew up in Ontario, and then I moved to Montreal. That was strange for everyone, right? This is our society. So when we talk about loving our neighbors, even our neighbors themselves are going to be different in 3 years. And they might be from Croatia or Antarctica or something. And we can't anticipate that. So, all that is to say, and along with all the other things, and then blah, 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 the internet and diet and all the rest of it. So, we have all these changes, and this is why it's fantastic that we're Christians, because we have essentially one law, which is to love people. That's it. See, this is a very stressful world to people who write many laws and who create very complicated cultures that need to be followed. But the greatest challenge and threat to the church historically has actually been ourselves and our attempts to contain God, to control the definition of who God is, to control how we're supposed to act in the face of God, to create structure to contain how we should love people. When Christianity is fundamentally a relationship. It's a relationship between God, it's a relationship with other people. And what all the stuff that I've been saying is suggesting that a lot of these relationships are changing by the day. So God, probably, Reverend Geoff says from the pulpit, God likes this. This is good. All the craziness that stresses out institutions and lawmakers and lawyers and doctors, as Christians, we should like this. Because the only thing that we can do, because there's nothing we can count on, is love people. And as we love people, and the world changes around us, and as we love God amidst all these changes, the church appears to stand still amidst everything changing around us. We go home, we love the people that live among us. Are they from Dubai? Are they from Orleans? It doesn't matter. Are they Muslim? Are they Christian? Doesn't matter. We love them. We go on the internet. There's a lot of mean people on the internet. But we love people because there are an enormous amount of cries for help on the internet that are never spoken aloud in real life. It happens a lot. Anybody that's on Facebook will see these very cryptic Facebook posts saying, "My life is hard," or something. And we tend to ignore them, because if you're on Facebook, you're like, ugh, I want to see the cute pictures of kittens. I don't want to hear people's... But these are cries for help. And they're cries for help that are mostly spoken to a group of people at work looking to be entertained. They're not looking to love. And that's our call. So we go online, we love people. We go to the supermarket, we're Christians, and we love. It doesn't matter what happens around us, because we have one law. It's really easy. And this is how the church survives. Amidst all the toil and tribulation and things around us, and historians try to figure out how the heck did they do that? Was their bureaucratic system? Was it this? No. The systems are usually always after the fact. The stuff that's happening now is loving. Loving God and loving one another. And eventually, when I'm old, we'll have built a new system to contain this new world. And we'll get stale again. And God will get frustrated and annoyed. But for right now, as the world is in flux, we're safe as Christians, because the only thing we're capable of doing as an institution is loving people. Because it's basically our only law, and everything follows from that. Amen.